Case 1. Isabella Guzman. Aurora, Colorado, August 28, 2013. She didn't run, she didn't scream, she walked out of the bathroom holding the knife pointed down, stepped past the man trying to stop her, and left the house like she had somewhere else to be. Isabella Guzman was 18. Her mother, Yoon Hoi, was 47, a photographer who worked long days at her own studio and, according to people close to the family, had grown genuinely afraid of her own daughter in the weeks before she died. Afraid enough that she asked her husband to sleep in the same room with her. The tension had been building for a while. Then it accelerated fast. The day before the murder, Isabella and her mother got into a fight that ended with Isabella spitting in her face. The next morning, Isabella sent her mother an email. 2 words: "You will pay." Yoon called the police that same day. Officers came out, talked to both of them, and left. Whatever was said, it didn't hold. That night, around 9:30, Yoon came home from work and went upstairs to shower. Her husband Ryan heard a crash, then his wife screaming his name. He got to the bathroom door and pushed, but Isabella was already on the other side, holding it shut. He saw blood start to come out from under it before she opened the door, walked past him, and disappeared. Investigators found Yoon Hoi on the bathroom floor with 79 stab wounds, 31 to her face, 48 to her neck. Isabella was arrested the following day at a parking garage. At trial, the picture that emerged wasn't of a calculated killer, but of a young woman who, by her doctor's account, had been living with untreated schizophrenia and delusions for years, including, her attorney told the court, a belief that the woman she killed wasn't actually her mother. A judge found her not guilty by reason of insanity and ordered her held at the Colorado Mental Health Institute at Pueblo for as long as she remained a danger to herself or others. That could have been the end of it. It wasn't. 7 years later, footage of Isabella smirking during a 2013 courtroom hearing surfaced online and went viral on TikTok, turning a woman who had killed her mother 79 times into an internet personality with a following. Around the same time, she petitioned for release, telling a reporter she'd been restored to full health and was ready to rejoin society. She also said something the original case file never mentioned, that she'd been abused by her own family for years and that leaving her family's religion at 14 made it worse. Whether that's true has never been independently confirmed. What is confirmed is that as of the most recent public reporting, Isabella Guzman remains committed to a Colorado state psychiatric facility, and her release is a decision that rests entirely with the same court system that once watched her walk out of a bathroom holding a knife. A daughter went viral for something no one should be famous for, and the next woman on this list didn't wait for a diagnosis to explain herself. She called it a mercy killing, and then dressed for a funeral before she ever created one. Case 2. Koua Her. St. Paul, Minnesota, September 3, 1998. A mother put on a red dress that morning like she was dressing for a ceremony. By nightfall, she'd be lying in her own doorway with an extension cord around her neck, and 6 children would be dead around her. Koua Her was born in Laos in 1973. By the age most kids are learning to ride a bike, she was living inside a refugee camp in Thailand. 10 by 12-foot partitions, no plumbing, entire families packed in side by side. She was raped there at 8 years old. At 12, she was married off. By 21, she'd had 6 children and relocated with her family to a public housing project in St. Paul. Neighbors in that building had watched the family unravel for years. Police had been called to the home more than a dozen times for domestic violence. By 1998, Her's marriage had collapsed. She was estranged from her husband, raising 6 kids alone and drowning in poverty with nowhere left to turn. On September 3rd, the children played outside together, the last time they ever would. Her called them inside one at a time, oldest to youngest. Koua 11. Samson 9, Nali 8, Tanglung 7, Ayi 6, Tankei 5. She strangled each of them with a black cloth as they came to her. Then she tried to hang herself with an extension cord tied to a light fixture. It broke. She fell, injured, and called 911 herself. At sentencing, her attorney told the court she'd been suicidal, and that once she'd decided to die, she couldn't bear the thought of leaving her children behind uncared for. In her mind, killing them sent them somewhere safer than the life they had. Whether the public was willing to call that anything other than murder is a different question, one that split an entire community down the middle. Koua Her pleaded guilty to 6 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 50 years, with parole eligibility after 33. She remains incarcerated at the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee, with an anticipated release date in 2032, when she'll be 59 years old. 6 children, one at a time, oldest to youngest. A mother who thought she was sending them somewhere better. The next woman on this list also wore red before she killed, but she wasn't planning her own funeral. She was staging someone else's, and then she went looking for a murderer who didn't exist. Case 3. Suzuka Hatakayama. Fujisato, Akita Prefecture, Japan, April 9 and May 17, 2006. Police ruled it an accident. A little girl had slipped, fallen into a river, and drowned. Tragic, but nobody's fault. Her own mother wasn't willing to let it stay that simple. She wanted an investigation. She wanted answers. What she actually wanted was distance from what she'd done. Suzuka Hatakayama was 33. A single mother in a town of roughly 4,000 people where everyone knew everyone's business, and where, by most accounts, she was something of an outsider in her own community. On April 9th, she was on a bridge with her 9-year-old daughter, Ayaka, looking down at the river below. What happened next depends on who's telling it. Hatakayama would later claim Ayaka had climbed onto the railing and grabbed at her, and that she'd simply brushed her off. The court that eventually heard the case saw it differently, ruling that she placed her daughter on that railing herself and made no attempt to help her once she went in. Ayaka's body surfaced 2 kilometers downstream the next day. Police closed the case as an accidental drowning. That should have ended it. Instead, Hatakayama did something that unsettled the people around her more than grief ever would have. She went looking for a killer who didn't exist. She questioned neighbors directly. She criticized the police publicly for their handling of the case. She demanded they reopen the investigation and find the person responsible for her daughter's death, a performance so aggressive and so specific that it started to make investigators uneasy in ways they couldn't yet explain. 5 weeks later, a 7-year-old boy who lived 2 houses down, Goken Yoneyama, vanished walking home from school. He'd been inside Hatakayama's home before. She'd invited him in to play, by all appearances warmly. Investigators would later conclude something in that moment curdled into jealousy over the bond he might have had with her dead daughter. She strangled him and left his body near the same river. Forensics closed the loop fast. Hair on the boy's clothing matched samples from her house. Fibers matched her car. When confronted, Hatakayama eventually reversed her earlier denials and admitted to both killings, telling investigators, according to reporting on the case, that she'd killed the boy so he could be with Ayaka. The Akita District Court sentenced her to life in prison in March 2008, rejecting prosecutors' push for the death penalty on the grounds that neither killing had been premeditated. Prosecutors appealed, arguing the sentence was too light. The Sendai High Court upheld it. As of the most recent reporting available, Suzuka Hatakayama remains in the Japanese prison system. She staged a public search for a killer who was already living in her house. The next woman on this list didn't need to fake an investigation. She confessed on a recorded wire, decades after everyone around her had agreed to just bury it. Case 4. Melissa Haskell. Upper Marion Township, Pennsylvania. August 26, 1992. For 20 years, a dead baby's cause of death sat on file as sudden infant death syndrome. No one questioned it. No one had a reason to, until a jealous divorce cracked open a secret nobody involved had ever planned on repeating out loud. Melissa Haskell was 19 in the summer of 1992, working as a babysitter for 5-month-old Ryan Bowerly in Upper Marion Township, just outside Philadelphia. She'd cared for him since he was barely a month old. She was also, by her own admission years later, deep in heroin withdrawal that August morning, and when the baby wouldn't stop crying, she gave him alcohol to try to calm him down. It didn't work. What happened next, the coroner never caught. Haskell told the family she'd found Ryan unresponsive in his crib. The autopsy noted bruising consistent with suffocation and a blood alcohol level that had no business being in a 5-month-old system, but none of it was enough, in 1992, to override a ruling of SIDS. The case closed. Haskell went on with her life. She got married. She had a son of her own. The truth surfaced through a custody fight. Years into a divorce from her husband, Michael Lefflar, Haskell reportedly told him something that stuck with him long after the marriage ended. A promise about their own child that only made sense if you knew what she'd done to someone else's. Leflar eventually went to police. Investigators reopened the file and got a wiretap authorized. On the recording, prosecutors say, Haskell told him plainly that she would never do to their son what she'd done to that baby, never put her hand over his mouth the way she had before. That single sentence reopened a homicide investigation 2 decades cold. The coroner's office revisited the original findings. The manner of death was reclassified from SIDS to homicide. At trial, a former EMT who'd responded the night Ryan died testified that Haskell hadn't screamed, hadn't seemed frantic, hadn't shown the panic you'd expect from someone who'd just found a baby not breathing. The jury convicted her of third-degree murder. At sentencing, Haskell maintained her innocence and told the court, "I loved that child like he was my own." The judge gave her the maximum available under the law that applied in 1992, 10 to 20 years. Ryan's mother told reporters she wasn't angry, only that she believed Haskell needed to answer for what she'd taken. A secret survived 2 decades inside a marriage, before it survived 1 sentence too many outside of it. The next woman on this list didn't need decades or a wiretap to be caught. The moment she opened her mouth on a 911 call, she'd already confessed to a murder that took less than a minute to commit. Case 5. Tracey Grissom. Northport, Alabama. May 15, 2012. She told the 911 operator she couldn't take it anymore. What she didn't mention was the $103,000 life insurance policy she'd taken out on the man she'd just shot. Tracey Grissom met Hunter Grissom in 2003, when she was 21, a young mother going through a divorce. He loved her son from that marriage like his own, and for a while, it looked like a real second chance. It didn't stay that way. By 2012, the marriage had ended, and what remained was a bitter, unresolved civil dispute, the kind of thing exes drag through court for years after the actual relationship is over. On May 15th, Grissom was driving near Lake Tuscaloosa and spotted Hunter's work truck parked at the Binion Creek boat landing. She told investigators she stopped on impulse, to snap photos of him working, evidence for the ongoing case, proof he had income he wasn't disclosing. She said when Hunter saw her, he gave her a look and a gesture that scared her enough to make her think he was coming for her car. She got out, and she emptied her gun into him. 4 shots, 2 of them in the back. He was unarmed. A witness on the scene called 911 mid-shooting, saying his boss had just been shot for no reason he could see. At trial, Grissom's defense leaned entirely on a claim that Hunter had raped and beaten her back in 2010, and that she'd been living in fear of him ever since. It was a serious allegation, and on cross-examination, prosecutors showed it didn't hold up. What did hold up was the insurance policy, $103,000, taken out on Hunter's life, with Grissom as the beneficiary. The jury didn't buy self-defense. They convicted her of murder. A judge sentenced her to 25 years. A decade later, from a private prison in Shelby County, Grissom gave an interview that complicated her own narrative even further. Asked if she'd meant to kill him, she said no. She said she'd wanted him to feel the fear she said she'd lived with, and that she'd had to reckon with that admission herself. She called the decision to stop that day at the boat landing something she'll regret for the rest of her life. A phone call that started with fear. A motive that ended with a policy number. The next woman on this list also called 911 after killing a man in front of witnesses, but she didn't stop at one shooting. She'd already survived one, and made sure everyone knew it. Case 6. Miriam Helmick. Whitewater, Colorado, June 10, 2008. She sat across from a national television audience 15 years later and said she knew, with total certainty, that she hadn't killed her husband. She also floated a theory nobody had heard before, that maybe he'd set his own car on fire for the insurance money. The problem is, investigators had already proven it was her hand on the wick. Miriam Helmick met Alan Helmick on a dance floor. He'd taken up ballroom dancing in 2005 to climb out of the grief of losing Sharon, his wife of 36 years, to a sudden heart attack. Miriam was his instructor. They married in 2006. Before the wedding, though, there was already a shadow in her past nobody at that dance studio knew about. Her first husband, Jack Giles, had died of a gunshot wound while lying in bed beside her in Florida, ruled a suicide, never reopened. 40 days before Alan died, the couple drove to Delta, Colorado. Miriam stepped away. Alan waited in the car. When she came back, his car was on fire. A wick-style device had been placed in the gas tank line and lit. Alan survived. When Delta investigators asked him point-blank whether Miriam could have done it, he defended her without hesitation, unable to imagine why she'd want to. He was wrong. 6 weeks later, in the kitchen of their Whitewater home, Miriam shot her husband once in the back of the head. She called 911, told the dispatcher an intruder had done it, and followed CPR instructions over the phone that investigators later determined she never actually performed. She staged the house to look ransacked. When Mesa County detectives started closing in, Miriam ran, first quietly, then completely. She fled to Jacksonville, Florida, moved in with her own son, and began building a new identity. Driver's license, credit cards, a paycheck stub, all in the name of Sharon Helmick, Alan's first wife, the one who died of a heart attack years earlier. She was arrested at a Jacksonville traffic stop in late 2009 with Sharon's identification still in her purse. A Mesa County jury deliberated 5 hours before convicting her of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and 10 counts of forgery. She was sentenced to life without parole, plus 108 years. 3 separate appeals have all been denied. And still, 15 years after the conviction, she sat down for a nationally broadcast interview and said the case wasn't over for her. That she knew, personally, she hadn't done it. She even suggested, on camera, that Alan might have staged his own near-fatal car fire to collect a payout. The forensic evidence that convicted her says otherwise. She's currently held at the Colorado Women's Correctional Facility. She spent a marriage borrowing a dead woman's name. She's spent every year since asking the public to borrow her version of events. The next woman on this list didn't need to steal anyone's identity to disappear. The state did it for her the moment a jury ruled she wasn't legally responsible for what she did. Case 7. LaShuan Harris. San Francisco, California, October 19, 2005. Before the pier, there were hot dogs. She took her 3 boys on a train from Oakland into the city, bought them lunch, and walked with them along Fisherman's Wharf like any other mother on any other afternoon. Passers-by had no reason to look twice, until she started taking their clothes off. LaShuan Harris was 23, a former nurse's assistant living with her sons in an Oakland shelter. She'd been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and had been hospitalized for it repeatedly in the previous 18 months. She'd also, by that October, stopped taking the antipsychotic medication that kept the voices quiet. She told investigators she'd felt better over the summer and believed she didn't need it anymore. The voices came back. On Pier 7, a low railing overlooking the bay, Harris undressed all 3 of her sons, 6-year-old Trayshawn, 2-year-old Taranta, and 16-month-old Joshua, and dropped them one at a time into the water below. Witnesses said she looked dazed, disoriented, not frantic. Her youngest laughed as it happened. He thought it was a game. She was arrested within the hour, pushing an empty stroller away from the pier. In her videotaped confession, she told police that God had commanded her to make a sacrifice, and that she believed she was sending her sons to heaven rather than killing them. Prosecutors saw it differently. Harris had reportedly cried afterward, walking the pier alone, which they argued proved she understood exactly what she'd just done. Only one body was recovered, found near a yacht club roughly 2 miles from the pier. The other 2 were never found. San Francisco's mayor at the time called it senseless and unexplainable, the kind of thing that makes an entire city feel sick. A jury convicted Harris of second-degree murder and separately of child assault causing death, convictions that on their own carried a mandatory sentence of 15 years to life. But a judge subsequently found her legally insane at the time of the killings and ordered her committed instead to a secure psychiatric facility for a term of 25 years to life. She can only be released if doctors and a court agree she's no longer a danger. A toddler laughed while his mother dropped him into the bay, thinking it was a game, right up until it wasn't one anymore. The next case moves the same kind of horror out of a public place and into a locked bathroom, where the only sound anyone heard was a 9-year-old girl calling her mother's name. Case 8, Amy Hebert. Matthews, Louisiana, August 20th, 2007. A jury sat through nearly 2 weeks of testimony before it took them less than 3 hours to decide she was guilty. 9 of the 12 wanted her executed for it. Louisiana law needed all 12 to agree. Amy Hebert, born Amy Talbot, married her husband Chad in 1991 and settled with him in Matthews, Louisiana, where she worked as a teacher's aide at the local elementary school. They had 2 children, Camille, born in 1998, and Braxton, born in 2000 and mildly autistic. By most accounts, Amy was a devoted mother, a Sunday school teacher, someone described by family as a former honors student and cheerleader who'd grown into exactly the kind of parent people assumed she'd be. The marriage didn't survive. The divorce finalized in 2006, and Amy struggled with what came after, particularly once Chad moved into a new relationship and eventually remarried. Family and neighbors described her as increasingly depressed in the months that followed, someone visibly worn down by a life that hadn't turned out the way she expected. In the early hours of August 20th, 2007, with the children asleep in their beds on a night before Chad was scheduled to pick them up, Amy went into Camille's room with a kitchen knife. 9-year-old Camille wasn't asleep for long. She woke and fought, and according to what Amy later told a psychiatrist, begged for her life as it happened. She was stabbed somewhere between 30 and 35 times, wounds that reached every vital organ in her small body. 7-year-old Braxton was next, and it was worse. More than 50 stab wounds, roughly half to his back. Both children had defensive wounds on their hands and arms. Both had been stabbed through the heart. Amy killed the family dog too. Then she turned the knife on herself, stabbing her own body multiple times before eventually being found, critically injured but alive, alongside her children. At trial, her defense argued she'd suffered from long-term untreated depression and experienced a genuine psychotic break the night of the murders. Prosecutors argued the opposite, that she'd been in full control in the days leading up to it, and that what actually drove the killings was raw resentment toward her ex-husband and the new life he was building without her. The jury didn't accept the insanity defense. They convicted her of 2 counts of first-degree murder. 9 jurors voted for the death penalty, 1 vote short of what Louisiana requires. Amy Hebert was sentenced instead to 2 consecutive life terms and remains incarcerated at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel. A daughter begged not to die. A jury came within 1 vote of sending her mother to die too. The next case moves from a Louisiana bedroom to a University of Arizona dorm room, where a campus that was supposed to protect 2 Native American scholarship students instead laughed off a warning that turned out to be fatal. Case 9, Gallera Harrison. Tucson, Arizona, September 5, 2007. The sentence that was supposed to be permanent wasn't. 5 years after a jury sent her away for life without parole, a judge reopened the case. Not because anyone doubted she did it, but because her own defense had failed to do its job the first time around. Gallera Harrison and Mia Henderson were both freshmen at the University of Arizona in the fall of 2007, both Navajo, both carrying the weight of being their community's scholarship success stories. They were assigned as roommates in Graham Greenlee Residence Hall. It didn't take long for something to go wrong. Henderson discovered her UA-ID card, a social security card, a couple of checks, and $500 in cash missing, and traced it back to Harrison. She reported it to campus police. According to Harrison's later legal team, the theft wasn't opportunistic cruelty. It came from genuine desperation. Harrison had reportedly emailed university officials explaining she couldn't afford books or basic supplies and hadn't received the help she'd asked for. She told her attorney she'd planned to come clean to her own family over Labor Day weekend rather than let it destroy the friendship. Henderson didn't wait to find out. She confronted Harrison directly and went to the police. A week later, on the night of September 5th, Harrison waited in another student's room until she was sure Henderson would be asleep. She'd already written a fake suicide note earlier that day, designed to be passed off as Henderson's own words. She let herself into their shared room and stabbed Henderson more than 20 times while she slept. 7 of the wounds struck major organs. A resident assistant woke to screaming, ran in, and found Henderson on the floor, bleeding from her back. Harrison was found curled up in the hallway, crying. Henderson died shortly after arriving at the hospital. Harrison initially told investigators an unknown attacker was responsible. She confessed on tape not long after. At trial, her defense argued she'd been bullied and pushed to a breaking point. The jury wasn't convinced, deliberating roughly 3.5 hours before convicting her of first-degree murder, forgery, and identity theft. A plea deal had already taken the death penalty off the table. She was sentenced to life without parole in 2008. That should have been the final word. It wasn't. In 2013, Harrison's new attorneys successfully argued that her original defense team had failed to turn over her medical and psychological records before the first sentencing. Records that might have painted a fuller picture of the pressure she was under. A judge agreed and resentenced her to life, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. prosecutors appealed. The Court of Appeals upheld the new sentence anyway. Harrison remains incarcerated at Perryville State Prison in Goodyear, Arizona. A campus that failed to catch a warning sign in time didn't fail twice, but its own legal system nearly did, before correcting itself years later. Case 10, Lindsay Haugen, Billings, Montana, September 15, 2015. She said it on camera, to a detective, in words plain enough that a streaming true crime series would later build an entire episode around them. She'd always wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone with her bare hands. Years later, in front of a parole board, she said she never meant it. The recording says otherwise. Lindsay Haugen was 32, with roughly a decade of military experience behind her. Service records and family accounts describe her as having grown up in a religious household before rebelling hard as a teenager and running away from home. By 2015, she'd built a life that included real trauma, reported abuse at the hands of more than one man over the years, the kind of history her defense would later lean on. In August of that year, she met 25-year-old Robert Mast. Within a month, the two were on the road together, traveling from Washington toward North Dakota to look for work. On September 15th, they stopped in Billings and parked outside a Walmart to drink wine. At some point in that parked SUV, Mast told her he wanted to die. What happened next is where her own account has shifted more than once. In her initial statement to police, recorded and later aired publicly, she said Mast's request gave her the opening she'd been curious about for a long time. She strangled him in the passenger seat while he was too drunk to fight back. Afterward, she drove 8 blocks to a Domino's parking lot and tried to perform CPR for roughly 20 to 30 minutes before police arrived and found her frantic, crying, unable to bring him back. Lindsay Haugen pleaded guilty to deliberate homicide and was sentenced to 60 years in the Montana Women's Prison. The confession, the specific line about wanting to know what it felt like, went on to anchor an episode of Netflix's I Am a Killer, turning her into one of the more recognizable names on this list. Years into her sentence, at a clemency hearing, Haugen tried to walk that statement back. She told the parole board she'd been drunk and in shock during the original interrogation, that the line about wanting to kill with her bare hands was something she said only to get the detective to stop pushing, and that she's been haunted by it ever since. Whether the board, or anyone watching the footage, found that convincing is a separate question from whether it changes what happened in that parking lot. A man asked to die. A woman said, on tape, that she'd been waiting for the chance. The next case moves from a stranger's request to a decade-long campaign of one woman breaking a child down completely, until she could point a loaded gun at his own father and make him pull the trigger. Case 11. Judith Hawkey, Mark Center, Ohio, November 3, 2003. The trial that convicted her of aggravated murder and put her away for life didn't hold. 3 years after a jury heard everything and sentenced her to die in prison, an appeals court threw the conviction out, and the woman who allegedly turned a 10-year-old into a weapon walked back into a courtroom years later to accept a plea deal that added up to a fraction of what she'd already served. Robert Breininger was found dead in his twin bed on November 3, 2003, at his home outside Defiance, Ohio, near the Indiana line. His 10-year-old son Corey was the one who called it in, telling deputies his father had been showing him how to handle a gun for hunting when it accidentally discharged. First responders had doubts from the start. The physical evidence at the scene didn't fully line up with an accident, and stippling from the gunpowder suggested a close-range shot. But Corey was inconsolable, reportedly telling one of the first responders it felt like his fault, and investigators ultimately ruled it accidental and closed the case. For the next several years, Corey lived with his stepmother, Judith Hawkey, who by his later account had been abusing him, physically and emotionally, for years before the shooting, and continued to control him afterward. Hawkey, meanwhile, had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on her husband, and reportedly began the paperwork to collect it the day after he died. The case stayed closed for nearly a decade. Then, between 2011 and 2012, Corey, by then an adult, told a former teacher, and eventually investigators, a different story, that Hawkey had told him his father had a brain tumor and wanted to die, and that she'd guided him into shooting him and making it look like an accident. Hawkey's version, when charges finally came in 2013, was the opposite. She claimed Corey shot his father after learning he was going to be sent to a strict military school, and that she'd had nothing to do with it. a Defiance County jury didn't believe her. She was convicted of aggravated murder, insurance fraud, and multiple counts of child endangering, and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. That should have closed the book. It didn't. In 2016, the Ohio Court of Appeals reversed the conviction, ruling that testimony from 3 key witnesses, including the teacher Corey first confided in, should never have been admitted, and that without it, the case against Hawkey wasn't as strong as the trial made it look. Rather than risk a second trial with that evidence excluded, prosecutors offered a plea deal. Hawkey entered an Alford plea, accepting that the state had enough evidence to convict her, without admitting guilt, to the far lesser charges of involuntary manslaughter and child endangering. She was sentenced to 10 years, more than 5 of which she'd already served awaiting the appeal. A woman convicted of turning a child into her husband's killer ultimately served a fraction of the life sentence a jury first gave her. The next case leaves Ohio for a Tennessee neighboring state and a completely different kind of coldness. A 15-year-old who wrote her murder plan directly on her own arm and pen before she ever picked up the knife. Case 12. Holly Ann Harvey. Fayette County, Georgia. August 2, 2004. She wrote the plan in ink on her own forearm, like a grocery list. Kill, keys, money, jewelry. When police found her a day later at a beach house 200 miles away, the ink was still legible. Holly Harvey was 15. Her mother was incarcerated on drug charges. Her father had been out of the picture since she was small. 4 months before the murders, she'd moved in with her grandparents, Carl and Sarah Collier, 74 and 73, devoutly religious, and by every account, genuinely trying to give her a stable home. They asked 2 things of her: stop using drugs, and stop seeing her girlfriend, 16-year-old Sandy Ketchum. Holly wasn't willing to give up either. On the evening of August 2nd, Sandy came to Holly's basement bedroom, and the two worked out a plan to kill the Colliers and take their truck. Freedom, in their minds, being the only thing standing between them and staying together. They'd spent weeks beforehand telling friends what they intended to do and trying, unsuccessfully, to get a gun. When that didn't pan out, Holly settled on a kitchen knife instead, and the two practiced stabbing a mattress to test the blade. When Carl and Sarah came into the bedroom that evening, Holly pulled the knife from her pants and stabbed her grandmother in the back. Sarah screamed. Carl turned, saw what was happening, and hit Holly in the face before trying to pin her down, but Holly stabbed him in the chest and called for Sandy to help. Carl broke free and ran for the stairs, trying to reach a phone. Holly handed Sandy the knife and chased him. Downstairs, Sandy stabbed Sarah in the heart, the back of the head, and the arm. Upstairs, Holly caught up to Carl in the kitchen and delivered the fatal blow. Both grandparents were stabbed more than 15 times. The girls stole the Colliers' truck, took the knives with them, and fled to Tybee Island on the Georgia coast, where they met 2 local teenage boys and talked their way into staying at a beach house under fake names. Investigators tracked them down and arrested them the next day, finding 3 bloody knives and the girls' blood-stained clothes still with them, along with the list still written on Holly's arm. Holly Harvey pleaded guilty to 2 counts of malice murder and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Years later, she attempted to challenge her own guilty plea through an out-of-time appeal, arguing she'd been denied a right she should have had to pursue it. The Georgia Supreme Court rejected the attempt in 2021. She remains incarcerated in the Georgia prison system. A list on an arm. A couple who only asked for church attendance and sobriety. Neither survived the answer. The next case moves from a teenager's crude plan to something colder and far more calculated. A 70-year-old Utah grandmother with a concealed carry permit who didn't just come with a plan, she reloaded halfway through it. Case 13. Mary Nance Hansen. Salt Lake City, Mill Creek, Utah, January 29, 2010. 10 years into her sentence, in a hearing room in front of a parole board, she finally said out loud what she believed had really happened that morning outside the preschool. It wasn't really her, she said. It was Satan. Mary Nance Hansen was 71 years old, a grandmother with a legally permitted handgun and a custody dispute that had been consuming her family for 5 years. Her former daughter-in-law, 34-year-old Tatiana Tanya Nikitina, had divorced Hansen's son and taken custody of their 2 children. By January 2010, Nikitina was building a new life, engaged to a man named Rod Hernandez, with a wedding planned for Valentine's Day, just over 2 weeks away. On the morning of the 29th, Nicotina finished her shift at the Salt Lake City preschool, where she worked, and walked out to her car. Hansen was waiting. Witnesses watched her approach the vehicle and open fire, shooting Nicotina 5 times in the head. When it was over, Hansen didn't run. She sat down on the sidewalk, called her son first, then called 911 herself, and told the dispatcher plainly what she'd done. At her plea hearing months later, Hansen made an unusual request of the court. She asked to be sentenced to death by lethal injection. The judge told her that wasn't an available option for her charge. Her response, delivered flatly, "Well, then I guess I didn't do a good enough job." She was sentenced to 15 years to life for first-degree murder. At sentencing, Nicotina's fiancé told the court what the loss had done to everyone connected to her: her children, her parents, her sister, himself, describing Hansen as someone he could never forgive. A decade later, Hansen appeared before the Utah Board of Pardons for the first time to speak publicly about the killing. She told them she'd been trying to protect her grandchildren from losing access to their father, and that she believed she'd been under the influence of something outside herself, evil spirits, she said, and specifically Satan. By then, she'd lost the very relationships she said she killed to protect. Her son had stopped answering her letters, and her grandchildren had moved across the country to be raised by Nicotina's family instead. As of that hearing, she remained incarcerated and eligible for parole consideration. She asked a judge for execution and settled for a decade of prison letters nobody answered. The next case trades a custody dispute for something colder and far more calculated. A mother who executed 4 members of her own family in a single night for a payout worth $700,000, then staged the scene to look like her son had done it to himself. Case 14, Susan Hendricks. Liberty, South Carolina, October 14, 2011. This wasn't the first time she'd shot someone dead. In 2006, she killed a man she said had broken into her trailer, and investigators accepted it as self-defense. No charges filed. 5 years later, she'd tell police an eerily similar kind of story about her own family. This time, nobody believed her. Susan Hendricks was 48, living on Pinedale Road in rural Pickens County. Her ex-husband Mark had moved into the mobile home next door to stay close to their 2 sons. Her older son, Matthew, 23, had recently moved back in with her to help around the house. Her younger son, Marshall, 20, had arrived just days earlier. Her stepmother, Linda Burns, was also in the mix of family living nearby. By Susan's own account, given to police afterward, the family prayed together often, and she claimed they'd prayed together that very night, hours before 4 of them were dead. Sometime between 2 and 6 a.m. on October 14th, Susan used a .380 handgun she kept in her nightstand to shoot all 4 of them. She shot Linda and Matthew inside her own home, then walked next door and shot Mark and Marshall. She placed the gun beside Matthew's body and left a note designed to look like his own goodbye letter, then called her sister that morning and calmly reported that Matthew had shot the others before killing himself. The story didn't survive contact with the scene. The gun found by Matthew's body was the same one Susan kept in her nightstand. Investigators found shell casings hidden in a closet and a blood trail that told a very different sequence of events than the one she was describing. Gunshot residue covered her clothing. Matthew's hands had none. The motive traced back to paperwork. Susan was the sole beneficiary on multiple life insurance policies covering all 4 victims, worth roughly $700,000 combined. In the days after the murders, before her arrest, she reportedly visited a print shop to alter the named executor on a family will. She was arrested at a motel with insurance documents and wills still in her possession. In court, Susan claimed she suffered from multiple personalities and had been mentally ill at the time of the killings. She pleaded guilty but mentally ill to all 4 murders in 2013 and was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without parole. The local solicitor prosecuting the case told reporters at the time that he'd never seen greed alone drive someone to a quadruple homicide before. She remains incarcerated in South Carolina. A woman who'd already gotten away with 1 killing prayed with her family, then made sure none of them survived to pray again. The next case swaps a rural South Carolina property for a bank teller's ordinary Sunday in New Mexico, and a killer who convinced multiple women he was 2,000 years old. Case 15, Linda Henning. Albuquerque, New Mexico, September 9, 1999. A prosecutor stood up in a New Mexico courtroom and told the jury he believed the defendant had eaten part of the missing woman's body. specifically so there would be nothing left to find. It wasn't the strangest claim made in this case. It also wasn't close. Linda Henning was a successful fashion designer, a former model who'd built a real life in Albuquerque, a home, a thriving business, an engagement to be married. In the summer of 1999, at a seminar led by a conspiracy theorist known for claiming the world's elite are secretly shape-shifting reptilians, she met a man who introduced himself as Diazian Hossenkopf. He told her he was a geneticist, a former CIA operative, and, depending on the day, somewhere around 2,000 years old. Henning broke off her engagement for him. What she didn't know was that Diazian Hossenkopf was a fabricated identity for a man born Armand Chavez, a con artist who'd faked his way through a medical career, sold fraudulent cancer treatments to desperate clients, and was, at the time he met Henning, still legally married to a Malaysian-born bank teller named Gurley Chu, and simultaneously engaged to 2 other women besides Linda. Gurley had already left him months earlier after a domestic violence incident in which he'd threatened to kill her. She told coworkers she was afraid of him. On September 9, 1999, she vanished after leaving work. Her apartment was later found scrubbed with bleach, though not thoroughly enough. Investigators recovered 7 spots of blood the cleanup missed. 120 miles south of the city, a tarp turned up on a remote highway, wrapped around blood-stained clothing, duct tape, and gauze. Gurley's body has never been found. Investigators eventually searched Henning's home and found a ninja sword in her attic, purchased, according to the receipt, on the same day Gurley disappeared. Blood recovered from Gurley's apartment matched both Gurley and Henning. Hair from the duct tape matched Henning as well. At trial, Diazian testified in Henning's defense, insisting she had nothing to do with the murder and claiming a third associate, a man named Bill Miller, was actually responsible. Miller would ultimately receive only a year of probation for his role. The jury didn't buy it. On October 25, 2002, they convicted Henning of first-degree felony murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and perjury. The felony murder and kidnapping findings meant she became the first woman in New Mexico history eligible for the death penalty since statehood. The jury spared her that sentence. She was given life plus 43.5 years, 73.5 years total. Diazian had already pleaded guilty separately and received life plus 61 years. The case became the first murder conviction in New Mexico history, obtained without a body ever being recovered. As of the most recent reporting available, Linda Henning remains incarcerated in the New Mexico prison system. Diazian Hossenkopf has since sought to have his own conviction vacated, claiming evidence exists that could clear them both. No court has agreed. A man who invented an identity convinced multiple women to help build his lies. Only one of them is still paying for it with a 73-year sentence.